Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he had the best conversation yet with U.S. President Donald Trump. He was speaking after a face-to-face meeting at the White House. The two were joined by a host of European leaders who accompanied Zelenskyy to Washington in a show of solidarity. The talks are aimed at finding a way to end Moscow's three-year war against Ukraine. They follow Donald Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska last week. Our correspondent Benjamin Alvarez joined us earlier from the White House, and he told us where Trump, Zelenskyy, and the European leaders had found common ground.
We know what they definitely share is that they wanted the meetings today to be quite different to the ones that we saw here in February, and I think that's a scene that many of the journalists that were here on the White House grounds back then also shared. We remembered how that shout-out evolved and developed in the Oval Office. It was very different today, but what's really remarkable is that all of those European leaders were actually here to prevent something like that from happening again. And even though they arrived before Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy arrived here at the White House, they were in a different room, so there was no opportunity for them to intervene. But they used the opportunity later on when they were in an extended meeting with both presidents, President Trump, the host, and President Zelenskyy. And they pretty wisely used those moments to say that the next step should be a trilateral with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And we just heard President Trump saying that he would also be there. So there was an opportunity, of course, for Volodymyr Zelenskyy to show that he's open, he's willing to have this trilateral. That would be the next step after these meetings here in Washington today.
There was a lot of discussion about security guarantees, ceasefire or no ceasefire before any deal. Do we have a clear picture of what the U.S. is pushing for here?
So there were questions on that too. When they were sitting at the table, our colleague Misha Komodovsky asked President Trump if security guarantees would work. Actually, this time he gave him a thumbs up. It's still not clear how different those security guarantees would look like if Ukraine was part of NATO. We know that's a red line for the Russian leader Vladimir Putin. The talks are, and that's also what the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said, Article 5-like guarantee. So it's not quite clear what the difference might be. It might be that if it's not part of Ukraine, that there will be no bases there, but there are still many open questions on security guarantees.
Trump felt visibly comfortable hosting all these leaders today. He even bragged about it on social media. Now that the meeting has moved behind closed doors, is the tone going to stay as friendly?
It might probably change. What's quite remarkable and I'd say quite peculiar is that those press statements happened before they actually sit down behind closed doors. It was the case when Trump met Volodymyr Zelenskyy in the Oval Office, and then also it was the case after this family picture that all of them took together where they answered questions even before going into these conversations. But we know that for the European leaders that are here, it's quite clear that they want to ask President Trump to increase pressure on Vladimir Putin and not on Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
What impact do you think it had that Zelenskyy didn't show up alone this time around?
And not only he did not show up here alone, but they met in Brussels before coming to Washington, the so-called coalition of the willingness and the way that they come here to show is to expect more support from the U.S. president, show that they're here together, that they want to talk in one voice, and also that they use those statements in a quite intelligent way, you could say. So Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz also praised Donald Trump, telling him that he opened this path that will now happen, saying that looking ahead that this will now be the most complicated part. But also they of course were closely following the talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Alaska, and also the talks here, being in the same building but not in the Oval Office when the U.S. president met Volodymyr Zelenskyy. So I'd say kind of a relief that that meeting went well, and we now have to see what the results are after this extended meeting with European leaders and with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
Exactly. Whatever the outcome, President Trump says he will call the Russian president after the meeting today. That was DW correspondent Benjamin Alvarez. Thanks so much for your reporting.
Essentially, I'm optimistic that collectively we can reach an agreement that would deter any future aggression against Ukraine, and I actually think there won't be. I think that's even overrated, largely overrated, but we're going to find out. We also need to discuss the possible exchanges of territory, taking into consideration the current line of contact. That means the war zone. Ultimately, this is a decision that can only be made by President Zelenskyy and by the people of Ukraine, working also together in agreement with President Putin. And I just think that's very good things are going to come of it. So I hope we have a good meeting. And if we can have a good meeting, I'll set up a meeting with President Putin. And if you'd like, I'll go to that meeting. And not that I want to do that, but I will do that because we want to save a lot of people from dying. A lot of people are dying, and we got to save them.
And I can now welcome Terri Schultz, who's following all of this from Brussels. Terri, EU leaders holding talks with Trump and Zelenskyy right now. From what you've seen so far, what has stood out?
I think what was really impressive as the leaders each took their turn at giving a short speech around the table was the level of discipline. It was very clear how much preparation they had put into this meeting, that they were all speaking from basically the same script, saying that Ukraine needs very robust security guarantees and that the killing has to stop. Now, where you could see a bit of difference was that only Chancellor Merz and President Macron dared to mention a ceasefire. Now that we know that President Trump is no longer in favor of a ceasefire, or at least doesn't care so much about it. Only these two leaders said that they believe it's necessary, Chancellor Merz being the most insistent on it, saying that he doesn't believe even that any trilateral meeting, that would mean between Zelenskyy, Putin, and Trump, could take place if a ceasefire has not been achieved. So those were only minor differences. Otherwise, they very much showed a unified presence there around the table.
Europe had largely been sidelined in the run-up to today's meeting, but today they did have a literal seat at the table. Do we know what changed?
I would actually trace this change all the way back to the NATO summit in June. That's where we really saw President Trump do an about-face on his longstanding negativity about the EU and about NATO, so about European countries in general. And he came away from the NATO summit saying that he understood why these leaders love their countries. And we've seen since then European leaders just relentlessly pursue Trump, trying to improve that relationship. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, known to have a very good relationship with Trump. Alex Stubb, the president of Finland, also in constant contact with Trump, trying to keep the messages of Europe going in President Trump's ear. You've also had a near resolution of the tariff dispute. So he also showed a lot of respect for European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen. So all of these little steps have really added up to a change in President Trump's appreciation of the role that Europe can play here in resolving the war in Ukraine.
Bottom line, though, what are they hoping to achieve there?
I think their aims would be much higher than their expectations, if I could say it that way. I mean, of course, they would love there to be an immediate ceasefire. Of course, they would love to see Vladimir Putin withdraw from Ukraine. Those things are not realistic at the moment. So what they want to show is that they are behind Volodymyr Zelenskyy, that what Zelenskyy can agree to is what Europe will support. They very much do not want a dictated settlement for Kyiv. So they want to show that they are with Ukraine and that Ukraine's future is Europe's future. So I think that they very much are showing that. It was really quite a show around the table today at the White House.
That's DW correspondent Terri Schultz. Thanks so much. And we can dig even deeper with Richard Walker, DW's chief international editor. Richard, quite an event at the White House today. What did you make of everything up to this point, because it's still ongoing?
Yeah, so, I mean, of course, the proof of it is going to be when we start hearing from these leaders after their talks. But I think there'll be a sense of so far so good. There was no blow up between Trump and Zelensky. This was, of course, the really big fear. And Trump and Zelensky kind of came to join that meeting that we just heard Terri talking about together. Neither of them were saying anything that seemed to imply that there'd been any kind of major blow up, also behind closed doors. And yeah, that sort of set of sequence comments by all of the different leaders all kind of gelled together very much. And I think, I mean, they're here partly to try to steer Trump, but also they're here to try to, you know, as Terri was describing so well, I think, during the course of this year, they've been trying to shift his perception of Europe from being basically a bunch of freeloaders, which has been his attitude until now, to a bunch of people who certainly respect him, maybe to the point of kowtowing, as we've seen in the case of some leaders, but that also can be enablers, that can help him to do stuff, that will, for instance, pay for weapons so he doesn't have to give them to Ukraine, stuff like that. So I think, yeah, pretty positive vibes so far. But we have to keep remembering that the one person who's not in that room is Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin, of course, on Friday seemed to pretty well steer Trump effectively too. So, and we don't know what he's going to say to anything that comes out of today's meeting.
Yeah, I want to take a closer look at something that was truly remarkable, because each of the leaders gathered there today seemed to raise one specific point. And I want to share with our viewers what the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had to say.
But now the way is open for complicated negotiations. And to be honest, we all would like to see a ceasefire, the latest from the next meeting on. I can't imagine that the next meeting would take place without a ceasefire. So let's work on that, and let's try to put pressure on Russia, because the credibility of these efforts we are undertaking today are depending on at least a ceasefire from the beginning of the serious negotiations from next step on. So
I will say, and again I say it, in the 6 wars that I've settled, I haven't had a ceasefire. We just got into negotiations. And so if we can do the ceasefire, great. And if we don't do a ceasefire, because many other points were given to us, many points were given to us, great points, please.
A bit of pushback here. Does that mean that's the end of the ceasefire discussion?
Well, but it is interesting. It is quite telling about Trump, isn't it? Because, of course, if you sort of schmooze him, then you'll have a good response. But if you, I mean, Merz, by picking up this point of ceasefire, is clearly a bit of a sore point with Trump, because, of course, he went to Alaska to meet Putin last week saying, I want a ceasefire. If I don't get a ceasefire, I'm going to be very disappointed. And then he didn't get a ceasefire, but then he didn't say anything about being disappointed.
And
he sort of shifted his position and said, OK, we'll do it Putin's way. So Merz, by bringing that up, this was one of the few slightly dissonant moments where it wasn't exactly ever dissonant. He put it very politely and, you know, before it brought along a lot of schmoozy comments too. But yeah, Trump clearly kind of pushing back at that. And I mean, to give Trump credit, it could be simply a sign that he feels that, look, we're not getting anywhere with Putin on that. So let's push on the areas where we might be getting somewhere.
One of these areas is security guarantees. And that is something that Giorgia Meloni of Italy and the French President Emmanuel Macron raised. Let's have a listen.
And in order to have such a long-standing peace for Ukraine and for the whole continent, we do need these security guarantees. And the first one is clearly a credible Ukrainian army for the years and decades to come. And the second one is our own commitment, all of us. And we worked very hard during the past few months among the coalition of the willings, with the support of NATO, to build the different pillars of security guarantees and our commitments. And you can be sure that the Europeans are very lucid about the fact that they have their fair share in these security guarantees for Ukraine, but their own security is clearly at stake in this situation.
What security guarantees would the U.S. be willing to provide?
Yeah, so we really don't know. But we have kind of two things which are being treated as new. First of all, Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, came out over the weekend saying that Putin in Alaska had said that he was open to security guarantees being provided to Ukraine as part of any settlement. And we're selling this as a major breakthrough. Well, this is actually something that the Russians have always said. So, I mean, earlier in 2022, not long after the war began, there was talk of security guarantees as part of any settlement. And there's also been talk more recently in some of the talks that were kind of the predecessors to this high-level talking. So there's always been a consciousness that some security guarantees would need to be involved. But if you look at the kind of fine print of what Russia is considering, these would be security guarantees where it itself and China would be among the guarantors, and that there would be requirements for all of the security guarantors to have consensus with each other that somehow the security of Ukraine had been breached before any measures were then taken about that. And of course, how are you going to have agreement among those guarantors if Russia is the one that's actually breaking a security guarantee in some way? But the question marks about security guarantees go even further. You know, what we heard Emmanuel Macron saying there at the beginning, he said, first and foremost, it has to be a big and well-supplied Ukrainian army. Russia has, in previous sets of talks, always said we want very severe limits on the size of the Ukrainian army. We don't know if they're still calling for that. So obviously, if Russia says, well, we're not doing a deal unless we have a severely limited Ukrainian army, then that defeats that part of the security guarantee idea. So this excitement about security guarantees at the moment, it is one of the few kind of positive things in the air at the moment that the Europeans are kind of grasping at, because the big negative in the air, of course, is this understanding that the Russians want Ukraine to give up a very, very significant chunk of territory that it might be almost impossible for Ukraine to do. So call it clutching at straws, calling it accentuating the positive. But yeah, around this whole area of security guarantees, there's an awful lot that we still need to learn.
There's an awful lot we still need to learn, and yet Donald Trump says that within the next 2 weeks, we'll know whether or not this war is going to end. That's quite a bold statement.
But, I mean, Trump is often there with the 1 week, 2 week, 24 hours, 6 weeks. I mean, yeah. I mean, so I wouldn't necessarily take a given deadline too seriously. I think what he's trying to say there potentially is that, you know, what they've been talking about, that the next stage after this, Trump has talked to Putin. Now Trump has talked to the Europeans and the Ukrainians. The next step would be, can there be a three-way meeting? They're talking about it as the Trilateral, with Putin, with Trump, and with Zelenskyy.
Now, the Europeans want to be there too, they're saying.
Well, I think what Macron was saying in the meeting just there was that shortly after that, you would then need to have a meeting where the Europeans were also involved, because obviously they play a role in terms of possible security guarantees, in terms of possible sanctions relief and so on. But the big next step that they're talking about is a three-way meeting with Putin and Trump and Zelenskyy. Trump says that he's going to talk to Putin after tonight's talks in Washington and, you know, present the results and say, OK, how's about it? Let's have that trilateral. And I think the way I understand him is, if Putin agrees with that, then that's the next step. If he turns that down, then we're kind of back to square one.
A long road ahead. That was Chief International Editor Richard Walker. Thanks so much.